Her friends were standing outside an apartment building in Limerick, waiting for her to come down. Jady Cristine Pereira Rosa was supposed to meet them, but she never appeared. At first, maybe it was just a delay. Maybe she had overslept. Maybe her phone was somewhere she could not hear it. But as the minutes passed, the silence became harder to explain. Her friends tried to contact her. There was still no answer. Eventually, they became worried enough to call the guards. And when officers entered the apartment on Lower Cecil Street that Friday morning, everything changed. Jady was inside. She was dead. But this was only the beginning. Because while investigators were trying to understand what had happened inside that apartment, another person connected to Jady was already moving away from Limerick. A man investigators would soon begin looking for. And before the following day was over, he would also be dead. Jady Cristine Pereira Rosa was 33 years old. She was originally from Brazil and had been living in Ireland for several years. She had studied law. She had built a life in Limerick. She worked there. She had friends there. She had become part of the local Brazilian community. And on that Friday morning, those friends were simply expecting to see her. Instead, they found themselves standing outside the building, wondering why she would not answer. After they contacted the guards, officers entered the property. Inside an upstairs apartment, they discovered Jady's body. The scene was immediately preserved. Investigators began trying to establish exactly what had happened. Because when someone is found dead inside a home, the first question is not always obvious. Was this a medical emergency? Was this an accident? Was someone else involved? The apartment had to be examined. The timeline had to be reconstructed. Jady's body was taken for a post-mortem examination. And then came the finding that completely changed the investigation. Evidence of foul play had been discovered. Jady had not simply died inside that apartment. The guards were now investigating her death as murder. An incident room was established. A senior investigating officer was appointed. Detectives began examining Jady's final movements and the people closest to her. And very quickly, attention turned toward one person. Her husband, Judismar Wesley Batista. He was also Brazilian and in his 30s. According to reporting on the investigation, Batista had already left Limerick. And the timing immediately became important. Because while Jady remained inside the apartment and her friends were becoming concerned, Batista was traveling away from the city. Investigators believe he traveled from Limerick toward Cork using public transport. That journey became one of the most important parts of the timeline. Imagine the two scenes unfolding at almost the same time. In Limerick, Jady's friends are waiting outside. They are calling her. They are becoming worried. Then the guards arrive. The apartment is entered. Jady is found dead. The building becomes a crime scene. Detectives begin arriving. Evidence begins being collected. A murder investigation starts taking shape. But somewhere else, a man connected to Jady is moving farther and farther away. From Limerick toward Cork. At that stage, investigators still needed answers. They needed to know what happened inside the apartment. They needed to establish when Jady died. They needed to understand what happened before her friends arrived. And they needed to speak to Batista. But they would never get that opportunity. Because approximately 12 hours after Jady was found, another body was discovered. This time in Cork. It was Judismar Wesley Batista. The man investigators had identified as a person of interest in Jady's killing was now dead. Suddenly, the investigation had changed again. There would be no arrest, no formal interview, no questioning about Jady's final hours. No opportunity to sit Batista down in an interview room and ask him what happened inside the apartment. The person investigators believed could provide some of the most important answers was gone. The Gards said Batista had been a person of interest and a line of inquiry in the investigation into Jady's death. They are treating the two deaths as a murder-suicide. But that does not mean every question has been answered. Far from it. Investigators still have to reconstruct the final hours before Jady was found. They have to examine the physical evidence. They have to analyze the movements of everyone involved. They have to determine when Batista left Limerick. They have to understand exactly how he traveled to Cork. They have to establish whether anyone saw either of them in the hours before the tragedy. And most importantly, they have to determine exactly what happened to Jady. That is where this case becomes especially haunting. Normally, when investigators identify a suspect, they want to hear that person's account. They compare the story against forensic evidence. They check phone records. They examine messages. They compare movements. They speak to witnesses. They look for inconsistencies. But here, the man they wanted to speak to was dead before the investigation had even fully entered the public eye. The physical investigation continues. But one voice that could have answered some of the biggest questions is permanently silent. And while all of this was happening, another story was beginning to emerge. Not the story of a crime scene. Not the story of a suspect. The story of Jady herself. Friends and members of Limerick's Brazilian community began speaking about the woman they knew. They described someone kind, friendly, bubbly. Someone who had built friendships and a life far away from the country where she had been born. And that matters. Because when a case becomes a headline, it is easy for the victim to disappear behind the details of the investigation. The apartment, the post-mortem, the journey to Cork, the suspect, the timeline. But before all of those things, Jady was simply a woman living her life. She had plans. She had people expecting to see her. She had friends who cared enough to know immediately that something was wrong when she failed to appear. Those friends were the reason the alarm was raised. And in a way, that detail is one of the saddest parts of the entire story. Someone was waiting for her. Someone noticed. Someone knew that her silence was unusual. And because they acted, the truth about what had happened inside that apartment began to emerge. As news of Jady's death spread, support began coming from the community. A fundraising campaign was created to help her family with funeral and repatriation costs. More than €25,000 was raised. Her employer was reported to be covering the cost of returning her to Sao Paulo in Brazil, while the money raised would help her family with funeral arrangements in her hometown of Sorocaba. Then people gathered for a vigil in Limerick. For those attending, this was not about a headline. It was about remembering Jady. The person, the friend, the colleague, the woman who had come from Brazil and created a life in Ireland. And when you look at the entire timeline, it is difficult to understand how quickly everything happened. On Friday morning, Jady's friends were simply waiting outside her apartment. A few hours later, they were dealing with the reality that she was dead. The apartment had become a crime scene. A murder investigation had begun. Investigators had identified a person of interest. That man had traveled away from Limerick. And approximately 12 hours after Jady was discovered, he was also found dead. From the first alarm being raised to 2 deaths in 2 different Irish counties, the entire story unfolded at extraordinary speed. And yet the investigation cannot move at that same speed, because now detectives have to work backwards. Minute by minute, journey by journey, conversation by conversation. They need to reconstruct what happened before anyone knew there was a crime. What was happening inside that apartment before Jady stopped answering? When was she last seen alive? Who spoke to her last? When did Batista leave? What route did he take? What evidence was left behind? What can phones, cameras, and witnesses reveal? The Guards are treating the deaths as connected. But for investigators, treating a case as murder-suicide is not the same thing as closing the file and walking away. Every detail still matters. Because Jady deserves more than a conclusion. She deserves a full account of what happened to her. And there is another reason this case has attracted so much attention. It crosses 2 cities. 2 deaths. One incredibly short timeline. A murder investigation begins in Limerick. The person investigators are looking at is already heading toward Cork. Then, before detectives can question him, he is found dead. It creates the kind of sequence that almost sounds like something written for television. Except there is nothing fictional about it. A real woman died. A real family lost someone. Real friends stood outside that apartment waiting for her. And now those people have to live with questions that may never receive the kind of answers they wanted. There may never be a courtroom where every piece of evidence is presented. There may never be a trial where witnesses explain what they saw. There may never be a moment when the person suspected of Jady's killing is asked to account for what happened. Instead, investigators have to rely on what was left behind. Forensic evidence, digital evidence, witness statements, travel records, cameras, timelines, and whatever physical evidence remained inside the apartment. That evidence now has to speak for someone who cannot. The Gards continue to investigate the circumstances surrounding Jady Cristine Pereira Rosa's death. And behind every technical detail in that investigation is one simple moment that started everything. Her friends were waiting. She did not come down. They called her. She did not answer. They knew something was wrong. And when the door to that apartment was finally opened, they were right. Jady was dead. The man investigators would later identify as a person of interest was already gone from Limerick. And approximately 12 hours later, he was dead in Cork, too. 2 cities, 2 deaths, 1 devastating timeline, and a 33-year-old woman whose friends are now left remembering the person she was before her name became connected to one of Ireland's most disturbing crime stories of the week.